Thanks, Harry. Okay, we just go into, oops, sorry. All right, we're good. Well, thanks, Harry and Dylan, for asking me to give a talk. You might regret it later, but let's see how this goes. And welcome everybody who's joining us online and maybe seeing it later on YouTube. My name is Jaren Kabukcu. I've just moved to Portugal. I was in Liverpool not too long ago. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about what evidence we've got for plant use in the later Paleolithic, predominantly late Pleistocene, and present some new evidence from recent work. So just in case you are thinking about, oops, I don't know how to, oh, sorry. Just in case you don't know what I'm going to waffle on about and you change your mind and you don't want to stay on, some things I want to talk about during this talk is, as I said, new evidence from Middle and Upper Paleolithic and Epipalaeolithic plant use in the Eastern Fertile Crescent, which is the more sort of eastern sector of the region known as the sort of core areas of the origins of agriculture and plant domestication, etc. Plus some new evidence from the final Paleolithic and Mesolithic from the Eastern Mediterranean. While doing that, I will try and address the nature of late Pleistocene plant use and selection in the vicinity of the sites, and then look for evidence for continuity and or shifts in major aspects of plant use. I'll also try and link up to regional pictures of late Pleistocene plant use in Southwest Asia and the Eastern Mediterranean, taking everything all the way down to the origins of agriculture. So just to show you a map of some of the regions that I'm going to mention. First, I'll give you some new evidence from Shanidar Cave in the northern Zagros, which, and I have some plant data from the Upper Paleolithic, the Bardostian phase of occupation, and the Middle Paleolithic Mousterian. There's also some evidence we have from the early Epipalaeolithic, from the late glacial maximum to the early Holocene from Palegawra Cave. I'll also mention some of the new work that I'm doing at Karain Cave and Kızılın, which is in the Antalya region in the south coast of Turkey. And I will later touch on some of the previous work that had been done by Daniele Martinoli for the Epipalaeolithic phases. And I have some tiny bits of new evidence from Franchthi Cave, predominantly from the final Paleolithic, and I will touch on some of the earlier evidence very briefly. So just to show you and give you an idea of what Shanidar Cave looks like, which quite a lot of people might already know. It was excavated by Ralph Solecki sometime much earlier in the 60s, and it was reopened by the team led by Graham Barker of Cambridge University in 2015 and 16. And so far, they've uncovered significant evidence for occupation during the Upper Paleolithic, also known as the Bardostian technotypological phases in the northern Zagros. And we have quite a lot of occupation evidence, as well as fairly well stratified deposits. There's also been new excavations and new evidence coming up from the Mousterian phases of occupation, and they are, as part of their excavation strategy from the very beginning of this renewed excavations, they've been sampling intensively for archaeobotanical remains, not just carbonized plant remains, but also for micro remains as well, which is what has enabled us to study the carbonized plant assemblage from the site in such great detail with fantastic preliminary results. So some of the work that I've done on the Upper Paleolithic phases, which hasn't been published yet and it is still in the works, points to the presence and use of things like wild nuts. So wild relatives of pistachios, wild almond, as well as a relatively well-preserved assemblage of small and medium-seeded wild grasses, in addition to a range of wild pulses, which are predominantly looking like they are in the wedge family, the subfamily group. There's some indication that we might have parenchymatous tissue, which could be tubers or other things with similar structures. And we had charred plant aggregates, which I will talk about later on during the talk, which we've interpreted as potentially representing carbonized remains of plant food items. So we've also been looking at what is happening in the wider vegetation. So just to give you an idea, we're starting to get good representation of a mixed woodland that is existing potentially in the vicinity of the site during the Upper Paleolithic occupation. And we do have a lot more samples to look at and work on from the Mousterian layers coinciding with Neanderthal activity at the cave. So hopefully a lot more exciting evidence is to come. Not too far away from Shanidar Cave is a cave called Palegawra Cave that we had published alongside my colleagues that dates to the Epipalaeolithic, also known locally as the Zarzian technotypological phases, which we were able to show that it starts out and extends from potentially the last glacial maximum all the way getting close to the early Holocene. And this was also a cave that had been previously excavated by Rob Bradford. And we were able to go back and open small trenches, as you can see here, to predominantly for sampling for bioarchaeological remains in a more closely controlled manner, smaller pits, and be able to have greater control over chronology and changes through time, especially in subsistence and site use patterns. And this was facilitated by, again, like Shanidar Cave, a very intensive sampling for archaeobotanical and generally bioarchaeological remains. So we used a bespoke built water flotation system that was able to deal with large amounts of soil being collected for sampling and processing things. And you have a photo of Marvin Domicoli here, one of the former PhD students who had assisted us with processing. As a result of this sort of very broad scale sampling, we were able to uncover not that many, but a fairly diverse assemblage of carbonized plant remains from the site, which include, again, evidence for use of nuts, with almond nutshell preserved. There's some few fragments that look like they could be pistachia, but they're not terribly well preserved and quite fragmentary. We have some small fragments and very battered tuber fragments, so underground storage organs, some evidence for wild pulses, again, relatives of wedge and grass pea. So these are small to medium-sized wild pulses. And then there's been some evidence for small seeded grasses and medium seeded ones, as well as very limited evidence for the use of wild barley, which is quite important to understand how the impacts on the ecologies of crop progenitors are shifting through the LGM into the early Holocene. So a small assemblage from a small area of excavation, and with intensive sampling, we were able to get a fairly good diverse view of plant use at the site. Similar to what we're doing at Shanidar Cave, we also had worked on looking at the wood charcoal, which gives us a very good idea of the kinds of habitats that are used, potentially in conjunction with hunting activities and plant food gathering activities. And we are picking out two main habitat types, and this is also supported by the plant microremain analyses that were conducted, led by Emma Jenkins of Bournemouth. And we are able to pick out more wetland habitats with the presence of things like wet woodlands like Salicacea, etc., and more dry and potentially open and steppe-like or semi-arid woodland environments that have evidence for wild almond being collected for fuel wood, as well as oak. So in addition to the seed, tuber and charcoal macros, we have also been investigating some few items that we found as charred plant aggregates. Some of them are from Shanidar Cave, as I mentioned earlier, but I also had found some from Franchthi Cave samples dating from the late Paleolithic. And these were published quite recently in Antiquity, and we interpreted them as food remains partially because they are carbonized as almost whole lumps or small fragments, but quite aggregated, not necessarily that many other inclusions in them apart from pieces of plants or plant tissue. In many of them, you can see fragments of seeds or other parts of them sticking out, and it is slightly vitrified in some of them, potentially indicating that there was moisture content during charring or before. So we started investigating these by looking at them under scanning electron microscopy, and were able to see that quite a few of the ones that we studied, so these were about 5 items from Shanidar Cave and 5 items from Franchthi Cave. Most of these contained fragments of pulse seeds in varying shapes and forms, with some of them, which I will show some examples later on. They have variable sizes. Many of them look like they have gelatinized a little bit, which I will also show you some experimental examples of, just to be able to see and understand or visualize. But essentially, things from within the seeds or cotyledons are getting mixed in with this matrix and forming into a mass, not too dissimilar to the way we would make patties or form something to hold its shape. This one that I'm showing you is an example that contained wild pea fragments, as well as other pulse seeds from the Baradosian Upper Paleolithic levels at Shanidar Cave. And just to show you a close-up of one of these pulse seeds fragments, which corresponds to this area of the fragment. As you see, it has, this is the seed coat that has actually been mushed a little bit and broken up and started forming into a gelled kind of mass, how to describe it. So we also had some evidence only from one fragment that I had studied from the Mousterian deposits at Shanidar Cave, which corresponds to the Neanderthal use and activity at the site. This also contained fragments of pulse seeds. So here is a fragment of the seed coat that has these palisade cells with based on thickness, looks to be the relatives of the vetches and lentils, as well as some fragments of wild grass seeds. We're not entirely sure exactly if we can get it to narrow down any further. And some evidence that you see in panel C that is suggesting that the various seeds that are included in this mixture are releasing their starches and other contents of the seed and mixing to form into a patty, and there is some evidence for modification of the structures and gelatinization with a close-up that you can see here. So I also, in the Antiquity paper, we report on, as I said, some remains from Franchthi Cave, which also surprisingly for me anyway, represented some continuity and plenty of evidence for the inclusion of wild pulses again in the wedge family. And this particular fragment dates from the final Paleolithic at the site, and here perhaps is recognizable to some who are listening is a fragment of the seed coat of a legume with the trace you can see outside. Inside it has been filled up with a gelatinized matrix, and there is a fragment of most likely a pulse seed. So if you imagine red lentils is inside the seed coat because they have been hulled, this is essentially a fragment of the inside of possibly a pulse seed or something similar with a similar texture and density, definitely not a grass. And they have all been embedded into this matrix of, let's say, goop. And we can see this one in panel D is a close-up of a pulse seed coat that has started to gelatinize and vitrify slightly with moisture content and things carbonizing potentially while they were still freshly made or freshly prepared, and plenty of other fragments of pulse seed coats, as well as other seed coats that have palisade cells, but potentially pulses because they are relatively short in height. And then we again had further evidence from Franchthi Cave for other preparations that have plenty of pulse seed fragments and various bits and pieces, and other seed fragments as you see dispersed within this matrix. And when you start to look at them closely, this is a close-up of, let me see. Okay, one of these areas where you can start to see this is the outer surface of the seed coat. There is a matrix here of various things that have been released into this food item as it is being prepared, potentially with moisture and some heat involved and some agitation like mashing, and it is starting to fuse and get gelatinized within that structure. So we started interpreting this essentially to begin with based on work that had been done on cereal cooking and processing from later periods in prehistory, but backed up by quite a lot of experimental evidence as well. And with the background of that work that has been done by my colleagues, we are able to pick out if seeds or other items are cracked before they are charred, which are the two examples at the top, or broken or fragmented after charring. We can also see some distinctions between cracking and then charring, or soaking, cracking, and then charring, and various treatments that involve soaking and pounding or cracking and forming into patties result in somewhat detectable signatures with some evidence for gelatinization that you see here, which, if I remember correctly, is example from the preparation of trohana, which is a sort of dried soup that is almost fast food in prehistoric terms. But it involves soaking and the treatment of the whole seeds prior to cracking or pounding, and then to be formed into patty-like things or lumps and stored as lumps. So if anybody wants to chase anything up, I have included quite a few names. And to follow up on this, I have done to date very, very preliminary experimental work. At the moment, it is not very standardized. I intend to chase this up in the coming years, but I would like to show you some examples of processing that I've done with pulses. And I've done a few variations whereby I was trying to get to the impacts of soaking or water treatment of whole legumes followed by mashing or crushing, and what kind of evidence we can chase up in terms of greater gelatinization and forming of a more patty-like structure, especially in the absence of seeds that have not been ground to a fine flour-like consistency, which is what the bulk of the evidence that we have from the food fragments are pointing to. I've also done a variation where I first cracked the seeds and lightly crushed many of them, so essentially splitting them into half or quarters and thereabout sizes, and then soaked this cracked items to try and form them into a patty. In both cases, I had to do long periods of soaking for the seed coats to let in enough moisture into the seeds to form any kind of aggregate or gelatinized mixture, or even something that resembles a mush or a patty. So it is essentially being, without soaking, at least in one of my experimental trials, it hasn't really worked, and we do not necessarily get this kind of fusing happening unless the seeds are actually soaked whole first and then mashed or crushed. Here are some examples of the experimental ones in various stages of carbonization, and I did some low temperature carbonization to be able to get a handle on preservation state, but also have done various really high temperature ones, which I think these ones are. Yes. So again, in terms of mixtures and forming into an aggregate, you can see the soaked and mashed seeds are resembling a little bit more closely what we get with some of the archaeological materials, but the crushed and then soaked ones as well are forming into clumps and aggregates, perhaps less so. So on the back of all of this various lines of evidence that is coming up from the Near East as well as the Eastern Mediterranean, we're starting to pick out some trends, let's say, and connecting lines, especially based on increasingly mounting evidence for the use of wild nuts and legumes as Paleolithic staples, perhaps in this region more dominant at many sites compared to the use of grasses and tubers. But without a doubt, there is use of grasses and tubers. So perhaps these are forming a broader strategy, and there may be aspects of seasonality involved as well in reliance on various things. And we're also starting to see that quite a lot of these things, so things like almonds and many of the wild legumes that we have evidence of, require multiple steps of processing. So at the very least, soaking and leaching, and perhaps also roasting or mashing and forming into patties to render them edible and remove some of the unwanted toxic or strong tasting chemicals, and convert them into more desirable foodstuffs, let's say. Some of the things that we're getting evidence for example, wild mustards and things like pistachios, etc., and oily nuts in general, could have been used for other purposes apart from just extracting nutrients like protein and starches, etc. So they may have had a role in meat preservation or flavoring of meat or other items, and they may have facilitated the processing of various sources of protein, including if there was consumption of small mammals or other things, in cases where they're close to marine environments, could have served a purpose to flavor even marine sources. So as it has been put forward before, there's always been this argument that broad spectrum arises more or less as a necessity out of environmental lack of environmental availability. What we're starting to see, at least from the plant use perspective, is that there's almost always a great deal of diversity, and many of these practices, especially some things like the focus on nuts and legumes, persist through various periods of resource abundance and resource decline. And one of the things that we really have to be very mindful of when it comes to the plant evidence is the issue of differences in preservation, whether sampling was done at similar scales and at the same level of detail, whether habitations had different uses in terms of seasonality or actual functional differences in their uses, and whether any of these things actually resemble and represent secondary foods or non-food uses. There's a whole host of things that are possible. So at least on face value, the plant evidence is suggesting that we need to look away from explaining things from an environmental availability perspective and consider the implications of connection through space and time, but also whether there are cultural and technological traditions associated with cooking and plant processing. And then, as I said, there seems to be very great geographic and temporal continuity in plant cooking practices and perhaps certain flavors. So I will now take you through a whirlwind tour of what we know with some of the evidence from the region. I will not be able to cover everything, and I apologize in advance if I've left anything out that you think is crucial, but feel free to chase up on any of the evidence to see for yourselves. So I guess one of the most iconic ones that we know from the Near East of the Middle Paleolithic is the evidence that has been recovered and reported from Palegawra Cave in the Levant, that provides evidence for the use of wild pulses, wild grasses, terebinth, which is wild pistachio, and plenty of other items. So it is more or less agreeing with what we're seeing on the eastern side of the Fertile Crescent in the Zagros. We also, coming back to Shanidar Cave, to back up some of the evidence that we're getting from the plant macro remains, the carbonized remains. There was also previously published work done by Amanda Henry on starch evidence from dental calculus of Shanidar Cave remains, which had implications for and evidence for the consumption of potentially barley-like wild grass in the Triticum family, so relatives of wheats and barleys, but more likely barley is what they had concluded at the time, as well as a range of wild pulses, possibly also the use of underground storage organs, tubers by Neanderthal. So it seems that the evidence lines is marrying up within what we're able to pick out. Going into the Eastern Mediterranean, there is some evidence for roasting potentially grass seeds from the Upper Paleolithic Kilisura Cave that was reported some years ago, which had provided evidence for these clay-lined structures or hearths that had masses and masses of plant phytoliths, so micro remains, impressions of the phytolith producing cells of grasses that seemed to suggest that there was fire exposure to these grasses, and potentially they were clay-lined hearths that could have been used for roasting grass seeds for consumption. On the other side of the Aegean basin, previous work that Danielle Martinoli had done at Carrane and Okizuni dating to the Epipalaeolithic, so this is again more or less 19 to 12,000 years ago, had provided plenty of evidence for wild almonds, which I have some nice drawings of her from of wild almonds, as well as a range of astonishingly well-preserved fruit remains, including rosehip here in the middle and rose seeds, and fragments of wild pear fruit. And there was some other evidence of use of oak acorn and hackberry. she did find at the time some legume seeds, but these turned out to be intrusive in the Epipalaeolithic layers, chased up by radiocarbon dating. So far, the Aegean basin and the Mediterranean coast of Turkey is looking quite similar to what we see in the eastern Fertile Crescent on the Zagros and Taurus, as well as what I mentioned from Kebara Cave in the Levant. Perhaps there are more items to be discovered. I am now working on the Upper Paleolithic and Epipalaeolithic layers from Karain and other sites in the region. And hopefully we can get more data soon to be able to chase certain things up. Going to the Levant again, work published by my colleague Amaya Ranz a few years ago reported on similar food items that contained a whole host of evidence for things like processed wild grasses, processed tubers, plenty of other inclusions, which they had interpreted at the time as looking bread or bread-like. And this dating from about 14,400, 14,500 years ago is pretty early in terms of this kind of fine ground flour-like preparation being a mainstay of consumption. So more evidence from the broader Mediterranean region, published a few years ago, again, on starch grains that were extracted from grinding and pounding implements from Grotta Pagliacci, had shown evidence for the processing of wild oats, possibly also oak acorns, and they were able to offer an interpretation that possibly suggested there was heat treatment as well, and maybe some forms of gelatinization. So again, it is looking fairly similar. So just to show you a regional picture in a very boring table as an overview, when we look across regions and across time periods, the great majority of sites actually do rely quite heavily on nuts, which are the first two columns here, as well as wild legumes. There is some sites, for example, Shubeika, where I showed you the bread remains from that dates to about 14,400, and the site of Valhalla 2, which also dates from the Epipalaeolithic in the Levant, seem to have greater reliance on wild grasses. Some other sites, for example, Abu Huraira in the northern Levant, appears to have an equal emphasis on elements that we see elsewhere in the region, as well as a greater reliance on wild grasses. But that being said, apart from a few sites, we see this general connection across time and across this very broad geographic area of certain defining flavors. Oops. Yes. So, and I did promise that I would tie things into the early Neolithic. So I have, again, a very boring map, a very boring table of various sites in the Fertile Crescent. And this one is focusing more on the eastern sector, so parts of eastern Anatolia, northern Iraq, and the central Zagros, which is again showing a very persistent reliance at many sites, not all of them. So there are some exceptions like Kertik Tepe and Sheikhabad, where we don't get as much evidence for a heavy reliance on wild nuts and wild pulses, but on the whole, they are persisting through time. And some of these sites in the Eastern Fertile Crescent, you start to get during this period evidence for the use of a greater use of wild grasses. There's always also some scattered evidence for reliance on tubers and underground storage organs, as well as other potentially small-seeded grasses and cyperaceae, so members of the clubrush family and rushes. When we look at the Western Fertile Crescent and parts of the Aegean, we see that there is again quite a dispersed and and potentially heavy reliance on wild nuts and legumes. There's more evidence in the southern Levant for early reliance on fig, which is here ficus. But this in the Levant, in the Western Fertile Crescent, seems to be going hand in hand with a very well-defined reliance on grasses more or less throughout. So perhaps there is an element that we're picking up in the earlier periods with the few sites that I mentioned that seem to have a greater reliance on grasses and potentially also tubers. So from this wild whirlwind tour, as well as some of the new evidence, what I can say at the moment is when we look at the evidence for plant use connecting the late Pleistocene all the way to the start of the Holocene, we can see some transitions in hunter-gatherer plant use, but we also see remarkable continuities. So Paleolithic and early aceramic Neolithic communities across this region routinely relied on certain vegetation types, and these are defined by the woodland components, for example, almonds and wild pistachios, but also their accompanying ground cover vegetation like wild pulses and grasses in many cases. Overall, there is, as I said, remarkable continuity in key components of what is used in plant food preparation and culinary practices for this region. And chiefly, as I said, these center on wild nuts and wild legumes and potentially inclusion of wild grasses in some areas. And perhaps there's a regional tradition that separates certain areas from others. What is for certain that both of these things are predicated on the management of semi-arid woodland habitats, as well as wetland habitats that contribute to the creation of very resilient and very long-lived vegetation niches that were potentially maintained or managed, perhaps not in a systematic way of what we consider to be actual management of woodlands to be, but protected or encouraged to grow in what would be human impacted or anthropogenic environments. And the evidence at the moment that we've got for this goes potentially as far back as the Middle Paleolithic. So all of this, I believe, can be improved, and our understanding can be greatly improved if we are to look at charred plant remains as well as plant microremains like phytoliths and starch, etc., from the broader region and across time periods, being mindful of the fact that they can also inform us about cultural and technological aspects of food preparation. And perhaps we can start to unpick environmental availability of plants within a close range of a site or within a foraging spectrum, and what constitutes chosen flavors or food choice in the broad sense. So I'd like to finish off by thanking everybody. There's a lot of people to thank, so I'm just going to leave this on and I can take questions.
Very good, thank you. What a really a set of amazing pictures as well. That was very nice. Thank you very much for that. If you'd like to stop sharing your screen and then we can...
Sure, I can do. I think everybody has seen all of my acknowledgements. So thank you, everybody. Thanks for listening.
Very good.
All right.
We do have one very quickly. Larry, go ahead.
Hi, Jaron. Greetings from sunny Merseyside. Yeah, hope you're settling in well. I think we as archaeologists tend to assume there's going to be a difference between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens when it comes to any kind of behavior. And that table you showed towards the end so there's really quite a lot of similarity in the choice of foods between Neanderthals and early Upper Paleolithic populations in that area. In the pursuit of this idea, there might be a difference. Do you see any differences in possible preparation and maybe the material, culture, the tools used that may help separate the two populations if you feel a need to separate the two populations?
I mean, it's so far as you suggest, there's remarkable continuity, at least based on the mainstays, if we can define it based on that. We don't have that many sites that we can address this question specifically. And what I've so far observed, and it requires a bit more lab work to be verified, is there isn't a huge degree of difference between what I'm getting from the Mousterian layers and what I'm getting from the Bardosian layers. So hopefully in the coming years, we can actually start looking at more detail and see if we can unpick any differences, however small, and whether they can inform our interpretation. So there's some sites in Europe where they've been able to argue that when you come to the Upper Paleolithic, so potentially representing early modern humans, you start to get perhaps similar items still being consumed, but greater diversity. So this is something we should be able to pick up as I do more samples from the Mousterian phases, partly because we have both periods represented at sites like Shanidar Cave, and they have been sampled at the same kind of scale. So if there is a difference, we should be able to pick it out. For now, on the whole, it looks fairly similar.
Excellent. Thanks, Laurie, for that one. We've got a question in the chat from Walter asking, has there been any evidence of animal matter mixed in with plant matter in charred remains? And did the diet consist of a mixed dish?
Yeah, so this is an excellent one. I do wonder about this all the time. At the minute, I don't have very many ways of being able to pick this out. This is something that hopefully we can investigate in the coming years, maybe using biomarkers, organic residue, etc. I don't see why not. I can imagine things being mixed together. I don't necessarily think they would have made plant-only foods per se. They could have, but I'd imagine that they would have mixed things, and perhaps the consumption of certain plants with very strong flavors could have facilitated the consumption of I don't know, fat concentrate, if that makes sense, like bone marrow and that sort of thing, to be able to store it or yeah.
Right. We do have a question from Linda Salmon as well. To what extent is it practical to detect the use of leaves or greens or other non-tuber vegetables at this point?
So we are able to pick out things like leaves and leafy greens in some cases, especially if we sample and have decent preservation of plant phytoliths. So these are the silica skeletons of cells that are found in the more grassy and leafy parts. Occasionally they should be preserved, and I do see some things, not necessarily in the Paleolithic ones, I'll explain in a minute. If there are leafy things or grassy things, they would be preserved in the carbonized food items as well. So I haven't seen any in mine, but when we see carbonized animal dung, for example, and herbivore dung tends to contain quite a lot of grassy things and fibrous, leafy yumminess, you do get them preserved, and they are fairly okay for identification.
Very, very interesting. Ian Stanistry has also asked the question, what about DNA analysis of some of the residues to detect meat as well as veg? Yeah,
so I have to admit, I work on carbonized items. DNA preservation is going to be fairly bad because of the temperature ranges, as well as the amount of time that has passed So for things that are like 30, 40,000 years old, I wouldn't even destroy them to try to see if there's DNA, to be perfectly honest. I think that would be challenging, but I don't know. Maybe things will get better with time and we can recover other things or DNA. Yeah.
Excellent. And I think I have a question. This is perhaps a little bit more personal, but given everything you've just told us, which seems to be very, to me, it's quite surprising, the level of detail that you can get. Did you find it surprising when you came up with this, after this sort of analysis? Did you find it surprising, the results that you had?
Yeah, so I mean, when I first started out, this was something we were starting to see, the burnt aggregates, and there's been other work done. So we're kind of piggybacking on the conclusions that other people were able to draw and say, okay, let's start investigating. Do we find anything meaningful or useful in them? And I was more or less expecting there to be differences when I started looking at the two sites that had the food items. And I was quite surprised that they had what looks like similar methods of preparation and similar range of things like wild nuts and pulses within them. And then I started looking at the more regional data and actually say, okay, well, this might make sense if you start synthesizing things in a slightly different light. But yeah, no.
No. Great.
I don't know.
We've got one from Anthony Sinclair as well. Hi, Jaren. Lovely talk. As you've shown, there is a considerable continuity in the plant species used across the Fertile Crescent. Do we have data on the nature of the plant communities surrounding these sites through time for pollen evidence, for example, so that we may begin to put the choice of plants for foods in their wider context? And might this be a way of recognizing a tradition/cultural preference?
Yeah, I mean, this is something I definitely want to chase up. One of the issues we've got is the sort of offsite paleoecological data does not necessarily cover the entire region. We don't have records for to be able to account for all the microregions within the Near East or within the Eastern Mediterranean to the same degree. But I certainly think there is potential in comparing offsite or more broad vegetation data, which is one of the reasons why we continue working on the evidence for wood alongside everything else, to be able to at least understand habitat types that are existing within periods. And hopefully we can, in the next 10 years, get to a stage where we can say, well, this is that kind of environment. These are the range of taxa that will be more abundant or more common or whatever, to be able to pick out whether there are preferences. And then we will hit some walls there, because there's picking out, I guess, what could be construed as niche construction or anthropogenic plant habitats from what actually exists de facto is going to be, it's going to take some further work. But yeah, very good point.
Very nice. Excellent. Do we have any other questions? Anyone willing to ask a question out loud? Oh, we do. From Jess Pearson. To what extent would variations in the stable isotope value of humans help to understand who's eating the foods? Who's eating the foods you're finding, and who's eating more or less than others?
Ah, very good point. So this is the problem with looking at only the plants is you don't really know who's eating what. You can get to phases or maybe sometimes contextual control, but it's, I think, I mean, there's been a lot of work done, as Jess has done, on isotopic evidence for diets that should be able to help us to pick out if, for example, certain regions have considerable consumption of legumes, because they do weird things to nitrogen and carbon isotopes, I believe. And this is as far as I'm going to say before I put my foot in it.
Right. Thanks, Jess. Thanks for that one.
Hi, Jess.
Perfect. Any other questions? I think we've grilled you quite enough.
Have I exhausted you yet?
If not, then I'd like to say thank you very much, Jaren, for doing that. That was really, really interesting. It's
No, thanks for
outside.
inviting me.
No problem at all.
It's been good to see people.
Good. We definitely love to have you back as well.
I'll come and say hello when I come.
Yeah, good idea. Thanks everyone for coming.
Yeah.
Really good. Next week we will actually be on a break. We don't have anyone for next week, unfortunately, but the week afterwards, we should do. So thank you very much, and thank you, Jaren, yet again. Really, really nice talk.
That's all right. Yeah, pleasure.
Thanks, guys.
Bye, you guys.